Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time John Bell Hood and John Schofield fought in the bloody Battle of Franklin. Now Hood pushes northward to Nashville, Tennessee. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. John Bell Hood had a few options after the Battle of Franklin. He could either retreat to the Tennessee River, but he believed the morale of the army wouldn't take another retreat. He could invade Kentucky, bypassing Nashville, but that may spell disaster heading into Union-held territory where the enemy could hit him at many different angles. Or he could push on to Nashville and lay siege to it and wait for George Thomas, the Union commander there, to attack him. Hood chose the third option, to invest Nashville. As one historian states, though, Hood was constitutionally averse to sitting on the defensive. For him to have decided to do so at Nashville for the first time in the war shows the poverty of the Confederates' tactical situation in December 1864. Thomas was thrilled with Schofield's entrance into Nashville because Andrew Smith's corps also arrived, bringing his troops in Nashville to around 55,000 men. This outnumbered Hood more than 2-1, with Hood only able to muster about 23,000 troops. Thomas allegedly grabbed Smith up and hugged him when Smith reported his troops in the city. The capital of Tennessee was a fort in itself. Forts, artillery emplacements, trench lines, and abattis covered the landscape. Nashville was impregnable, especially against such a weak army that Hood possessed in early December. When Hood laid siege to Nashville, and historians use that term very loosely, to cover the entire city south of the Cumberland River, Hood would have needed 10 miles of entrenchments. He didn't have enough men to man that distance. What he ended up with was 4 miles of works, still too long for 20,000 men to man. Stephen D. Lee's corps was in the center, Benjamin Cheatham's corps on the right, and Alexander P. Stewart's corps on the left. The most controversial move by Hood came when he settled into his semi-siege of Nashville. He dispatched his cavalry commander, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and a division of infantry under William Bate to capture Union soldiers and outposts along the railroad leading toward Murfreesboro, and caused destruction to said railroad. This further weakened his force sitting in the trenches around Nashville. On the Union side, Thomas was preparing for a movement against Hood and was being prodded by Ulysses S. Grant, the commander of all Union forces. The Union cavalry around Nashville were in a poor state, and Thomas dispatched James Wilson, one of his cavalry commanders, to refit the mounted arm of his army. This would take time. Meanwhile, Grant kept sending him messages about attacking Hood, fearing that Hood may strike for the Ohio River or that he would grow too strong for Thomas to handle. The Lincoln administration grew concerned over this lack of action as well. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton wired Grant that Thomas seems unwilling to attack because it is hazardous, as if all war was anything but hazardous. If he waits for Wilson's cavalry to get ready, Gabriel will be blowing his last horn. At one point, Grant wired Halleck to replace Thomas with Schofield, but suspended the order when he received a message that Thomas had planned to attack that day, but a winter storm of snow and ice prevented him from launching his attack. Grant told Thomas that he had sent the order, but had suspended it on the condition that Thomas would attack as soon as possible. Thomas grew resentful at Grant for urging him to attack, especially when Grant had been stalled out outside of Richmond. Grant had had enough and filled out the paperwork replacing Thomas with Major General John A. Logan. He sent Logan to Nashville with the orders that if Thomas hadn't attacked Hood by the time he arrived, then to take over command and attack Hood at once. A few days after sending Logan off, Grant decided to make the journey himself to Nashville. Eventually, Thomas got his cavalry in order, but by that point a snowstorm and freezing conditions made an attack impossible. He called together a council of war and nearly unanimously they agreed not to attack yet and wait until the weather cleared. Hood predicted that an assault on his lines would come as the weather improved, and issued orders to his corps commanders to expect an attack. The mass of blue troops from Thomas's 3 corps marched out of their entrenchments and formed for the assault in the early morning hours of December 15, 1864. Thomas's plan was to attack Hood's right flank, hoping to make Hood reinforce that sector with troops from his left, so Thomas's main attack would be more successful. On Thomas's left was black and white troops under James Steedman. It wasn't only Union soldiers who poured out of the capital, it was the populace as well. A member of the 23rd Corps remembered, Citizens of Nashville, nearly all of whom were in sympathy with the Confederacy, came out of the city in droves. All the hills in our rear were black with human beings watching the battle, but silent. No army on the continent ever played on any field to so large and so sullen an audience. Steedman launched his attack against the Confederate right flank at 8 a.m., but the attacks were driven back by Cheatham's corps. The demonstration didn't have the desired effect that Thomas hoped for. Hood believed the real attack would come on his left, and even moved troops from his right to strengthen his left. When the morning fog burned off, Thomas launched his major attack at 2:30 p.m. The Union troops pushed in the rebel skirmishers, giving chase. Wilson's cavalry pushed back the Confederate cavalry on the big swing to the left, orchestrated by Thomas. 30,000 Union infantry converged on Hood's left flank. During the advance, Schofield's line gradually moved to the left instead of moving to the right and allowing Wilson to swing wider and get in the rear of the rebel line. Schofield maneuvered his corps to the right to help drive the rebels back. Sergeant James R. Maxwell, who commanded a section of artillery on the Confederate left, remembered when the Federals began their attack. When the charging Federals passed my gun on the left of the redoubt, Lieutenant Hargrove ordered us to leave it. I ran towards Captain Lumsden's section, where Sergeant Jim Jones had turned number 2 to fire canister at the Federals, who were near gun number 4. He called to me, "Look out, Jim." I dropped on my hands and knees whilst he fired that canister right over my head. I took my place between his gun and the embrasure, helping handle the gun, and he gave the double canister charge again. Captain Lumsden was standing with another charge of canister in his hands. The command had been given to fire, but the man with the friction primers had run. I called out, "Captain, he's gone with the friction primers." Says Captain Lumsden, "Take care of yourself, boys." As he said that, down by my side between gun and embrasure dropped a Federal soldier with his rifle. I left him right there and lit down the hill. As I got about halfway to the creek at the bottom of the hill, I ran over an infantryman's Enfield rifle. Noticing that it was cocked with the cap shining on its nipple, I grabbed it up and fired at a Federal soldier who was waving his hat at the guns I had just left. The Confederate line couldn't withstand the punishment, and the left flank broke, sending the rebels southward. But Hood wasn't defeated yet. He began forming a second defensive line in the darkness. Later that evening, Sergeant Maxwell of the artillery recounted another story. Captain Lumsden was reporting to General Stuart, who was congratulating Captain Lumsden for detaining the advance of the Federals so long. Howland L. Rosser, one of our gunners, had had part of his head shot away. That night, as I was pouring some water for Lumsden to wash, he was picking something out of his beard, and said, "Maxwell, that is part of Rosser's brains." Thomas sat down that night and penned a telegram to the War Department saying, "I attacked the enemy's left this morning and drove it from the river, below the city, very nearly to the Franklin Pike, a distance about 8 miles, having captured between 800 and 1,000 prisoners and 16 pieces of artillery. The troops behaved splendidly, all taking their share in assaulting and carrying the enemy's breastworks. I shall attack the enemy again tomorrow if he stands to fight, and if he retreats during the night, will pursue him, throwing a heavy cavalry force in his rear to destroy his trains if possible." Grant wired back, "I was just on my way to Nashville, but I shall go no further. Push the enemy now and give him no rest until he is entirely destroyed. Your army will cheerfully suffer many privations to break up Hood's army and render it useless for further operations. Do not stop for trains or supplies, but take them from the country as the enemy have done. Much is now expected." The next day, Thomas intended to use the same strategy as the day before, launch a demonstration with his left, and launch the main attack from his right. This time, Thomas would supplement Steedman's attack with part of Beatty's division. They attacked, but ran up against the fresh corps of Stephen D. Lee. General Thomas Wood recalled the attack of Steedman and Beatty's divisions. The troops were full of enthusiasm, and the splendid array in which the advance was made gave hopeful promise of success. Near the foot of the ascent of the assaulting force dashed forward for the last great effort. It was welcomed with the most terrific fire of grape and canister and musketry, but its course was onward. When near, however, the enemy's works, his reserves on the slope of the hill rose and poured in a fire before which no troops could live. Unfortunately, the casualties had been particularly heavy among the officers, and more unfortunately still, when they had arrived almost at the abattis, while gallantly leading his brigade, the chivalric post was struck down by a grape shot and his horse killed under him. The brigade, its battalions bleeding, torn, and broken, first halted and then began to retire, but there was little disorder and nothing of panic. After the repulse of our soldiers, white and black lay indiscriminately near the enemy's works at the outer edge of the abattis. Just like the day before, the main Union attack began, and the Federal skirmishers were again pushed in, but the Union Corps commanders were much more cautious than the day before. The left flank of the Confederate line was dominated by Shies Hill, which made many of those Union generals cautious, but not Union Brigadier General John MacArthur. MacArthur was a Scottish-born immigrant to the United States. He became a proprietor of an ironworks in Chicago, Illinois, and when the war began he joined an Illinois regiment, quickly rising through the ranks, serving in the battles of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Corinth, and during the siege of Vicksburg. Before coming to Nashville, MacArthur had been with Andrew Smith's corps in Missouri, fighting Confederate General Sterling Price. MacArthur became aggravated at the lack of aggression shown by the corps commanders at Nashville. He also saw that where the Confederate cannons were positioned, they couldn't depress the barrels enough to hit his infantry. So MacArthur sent a message to his commander saying that if he didn't receive an order against it, he would be attacking the Confederate position with his whole division in 5 minutes. Those minutes passed, and no order to the contrary came. MacArthur assaulted the Confederate works, with the Union cavalry working their way around the Confederate left flank. The Confederate left and center fell, brigade by brigade, as the Union vice around them signaled that if they didn't run, they'd be captured. The Confederate right under Lee held on amazingly, with Lee himself attempting to rally those who may be trying to run. One soldier remembered, Lee rode until he reached the rear of Stevenson's division of his corps, rode right into the midst of the fugitives and in the face of the enemy, who by this time had reached the rear of Pettus's brigade. General Lee seized a stand of colors from a color bearer and carried it on horseback, appealing to the men to rally. "Rally, men, rally! For God's sake, rally!" he cried. "This is the place for brave men to die." The effect was electrical. Men gathered in little knots of 4 or 5, and he soon had around him 3 or 4 other stands of colors. The Federals, meeting this resistance, hesitated and halted. It was late in the evening and misty. The rally enabled Clayton's division to form a nucleus and establish a line of battle on one of the Overton Hills to the rear, crossing the Franklin Pike in the woods near Colonel Overton's house. General Lee came back from his advanced position to this line. Here he was joined by a few pieces of artillery and a little drummer boy who beat the long roll in perfect time as Gibson's brigade came up and formed a rear guard. Lee's stand helped save many Confederates who would have been swallowed up by the onrushing Federals, but the line still had to retreat. Thomas and the rest of the Union Army began a pursuit of the enemy. Thomas rode up to Wilson and shouted so loud that he might have been heard a quarter mile away, "Dang it to hell, Wilson, didn't I tell you we could lick 'em?" Wilson wrote later that Thomas, who was famed as one of the most reserved and most dignified men, and who never used profane language, on this occasion he said "dang it" with all the vehemence of an old dragoon. Hood's army marched to the Harpeth River in Franklin. There, Lee was wounded, and he handed command over to Carter Stevenson. Hood needed to put a river between himself and Thomas. He had 2 options, either the Duck River or the Tennessee River. After consultation with Nathan Bedford Forrest, they decided on the Tennessee River. After the battle, Thomas went to the left side of his line to examine the field. This section was where the African-American soldiers fought. He saw the black soldiers intermingled with the white soldiers and realized that they had made it the same distance into the Confederate works and fought to take and hold that position. He turned to his staff and said, "Gentlemen, the question is settled. Blacks will fight." He later remarked, "This proves the manhood of the black man." This statement by Thomas signified a change in the general. He was born in a slaveholding family, owned slaves himself, but through the events of the Civil War, his ideas about race evolved to a point that now he saw their abilities as equal to that of the white soldiers. As burial crews and roll calls sounded, Thomas found that the Union lost 3,849 soldiers, 363 killed, 2,289 wounded, and 1,197 missing or captured. The numbers for the Confederate losses are estimates, and historians range between 1,500 and 2,300 rebels killed or wounded. The number of captured is better known because Thomas reported 4,462 prisoners gained from the battle. The pursuit probably yielded another 4,000 because the Union sources report 635 Confederates captured for the month of December. Whether it was 1,500 or 2,300, Hood's army was wrecked. Hood's army slogged along the muddy roads south. The only thing protecting them from complete disaster was the work of the rear guard, primarily commanded by Forrest, who with tenacity and sheer will fended off Wilson's cavalry and helped wounded soldiers keep up with the rear. Men with tattered clothing suffered, and those without shoes covered their bare feet as best they could. Food was scarce, and as the precipitation froze, the ice covered the trees and made it impossible to build fires to dry clothing or warm cold bodies. The intense cold was almost a blessing, however, for before the roads froze, the earth was a sea of mud that exhausted the animals as they tried to draw supply wagons and artillery through the mire. Weary horses and mules collapsed for lack of forage. The army moved from Franklin to Columbia, putting as much distance as possible between the Army of the Tennessee and the Union forces under Thomas. Hood got to Florence, where the army rested, and attempted to gather as much supplies as possible. Then they crossed the Tennessee River. When they got across, they were relatively safe from any immediate threat by major Union forces. But northern Alabama still teemed with Federals. The army moved to Corinth by rail cars. While the army moved, Hood attempted to downplay his defeat during the campaign, going so far as to say that there was very little material loss, even though he reported 54 pieces of artillery lost to capture at Nashville alone. From Corinth, Hood and the troops moved to Tupelo, where Hood intended to refit the troops. Word came from the War Department to send troops to Augusta, Georgia, to contest the invasion of South Carolina by William T. Sherman. After visits to the army by officials and General Richard Taylor, it was decided that the army couldn't be moved at the present time. General P.G.T. Beauregard, Hood's departmental commander, went to visit the army in Tupelo with the intention of relieving Hood of command, but on January 13th, Hood acted first, asking to be relieved. The Confederacy quickly accepted his request, thus ending Hood's time as army commander. Richard Taylor would take temporary command of the army as it sat at Tupelo. The army was in a sad state. One man described his fellow soldiers. The regiment numbers about 150 men, about half of whom are barefoot. All are ragged, dirty, and covered with vermin, some not having sufficient clothing to hide their bodies. There are perhaps 20 guns, but not a single cartridge box in the regiment. The men are jovial enough in regard to their condition and their environment, but when it comes to discussing the prosecution of the war, they are entirely despondent, being fully convinced that the Confederacy is gone. Hood's losses during the campaign are horrendous. Using the higher estimates for the killed and wounded at Nashville, Hood lost around 23,500 men on this campaign, 8,600 killed or wounded, 13,189 captured, and 2,000 deserted. This stands in stark contrast to the Union, which lost 6,598, 725 killed, 4,424 wounded, 1,445 missing or captured. This puts the total losses for both armies at 30,098. Hood's Tennessee campaign left the Army of Tennessee in pieces. Some of its best commanders had been either sent away from the army or killed or wounded in the battles in Tennessee. The Army's initial move into Tennessee elicited some hope for the Confederacy, but Hood's mishandling of the Army reduced it to an ineffective fighting force. That's not to say that Hood did nothing right. One can see the influence Robert E. Lee had on Hood. Hood made great flanking movements, moving into Tennessee with purpose, but he didn't know how to handle his subordinates. He tried to mimic Lee, who gave a lot of leeway to his corps commanders when he knew he could trust them. Hood's hands-off approach led to mistakes like at Spring Hill. The Tennessee campaign will be remembered for highlighting Hood's inability to command an army, but it also demonstrates the resoluteness of his opponent, George Thomas. Thomas was one of the most capable commanders the Union possessed, but the prodding of Grant to get him to attack the enemy irritated the Virginian. Thomas would write, "I thought, after what I had done in the war, that I ought to be trusted to decide when the battle should be fought. I thought I knew better when it should be fought than anyone could know as far off as City Point, Virginia." A jab at Grant, whose headquarters was at City Point, while Thomas was at Nashville. Although the Tennessee campaign ended in a disastrous defeat for the Confederate Army of Tennessee, it would soon reform and be transferred to the Carolinas to combat William T. Sherman in his push north, but this time they would be commanded by their old commander, Joseph E. Johnston.